Direct farming was 1/3 of the land mass of the planet. Forests, which are very commonly used also for food gathering, non-wood forest product, etc., are another 1/3 of the land mass. So that gives you a lot of space for making species extinct. So let's look a little bit at some of the mechanisms through which agriculture, food, what we're going to be eating tomorrow night, we're going to be eating what we had for breakfast, how all of these are in fact very closely linked to the process that is worrying us, which is the loss of biodiversity and extinction through various angles. Again, here, I'm going to limit myself because we will open this into a discussion. So, the agriculture expansion, I mean by that the process by which natural habitats are converted into farmland, that is driven by the demand for food, which is also associated with the homogenization of diets worldwide. You walk on this street, you walk on High Street, anywhere in any other country, mostly in the north, but also in many countries in the global south, you're going to see similar food based on, manufactured, industrialized, etc. So this homogenization is essentially based on the use of more animal products. Put this on one side because that's an important part of our discussion. According to the FAO, 80% of worldwide deforestation is caused by agriculture. So agriculture is going to be really important for us if we're looking at extinction in terms of biological diversity. I'm not going to stick to biological diversity and biodiversity. I'm going to talk about something else later, but I'm focusing right now on this. You cannot put agriculture on the side if you're concerned about extinction, and therefore you can't put your diet aside. Now, diets are not completely made by us. We just happen to consume them, but that's also a different discussion. So, for example, in the Amazon, which is the lung of the earth, is quickly becoming the colon of the earth because it's being deforested in order to plant soya. One of the worst things you can actually plant. Again, I can talk more about this, for cattle ranching, and also for intensive production of beef and dairy, and the chicken, right, which have become ubiquitous in most of our diets. I'm sure there are people who are aware, especially if you're in this room today, you're not randomly selected, but that is a big problem. The rate has surged to its highest level over the past decade, especially before Lula came back to power, because the previous president of Brazil was actually in cahoots with the big agribusinesses of Brazil, and this is what made him president. So we're seeing some linkages which are happening at a higher level, not only at the level of our diet, making us responsible for this. So this is again the whole habitat destruction. The trend towards monoculture, or the cultivation of a single crop over vast areas, exacerbates the decline in biodiversity. So when we're looking at these large fields of sunflowers or of grape brassica, we're always amazed by these beautiful, vast areas of yellow turning all towards the sun. That's super poetic. But that's not a Van Gogh painting. That is the worst thing probably that can happen, and we've learned to find it pretty because of its aesthetics. But there is worse than that. I mean, there is a big problem, which is, and I'm sure you probably heard about it, I just wanted to make sure that we know that 75% of the global food supply comes just from 12 plants and 5 animal species. That, if there's ever going to be an extinction of humans, that's certainly going to be accelerated by the fact that there can be any shock, any black swan type shock that can affect any of those plants. We've seen this driving a lot of the recent food crisis, the most recent one in 2008 because of bad harvest. We've also seen what happened when the global harvests of grain were quote unquote threatened. I don't believe it was, but let's assume that that was threatened by the war in Ukraine. There's been a big upheaval, and that was used to say because of the dependency, of course, on grain generally and on wheat specifically. So most of what that was not always the case. A lot of the food that we have eaten historically has completely disappeared. In Lebanon, no one remembers when people used to eat millet, for example, which is way more adapted, although it's a different story. Because I have only limited time, I'm not going to tell you that story, but wheat originates from this region, and now it's become unadapted to this region because of processes of change that have taken it to northern climes, and we're trying to bring it back. Let's put this on the side for the moment, but a lot of foods have disappeared. In Lebanon and in our Middle Eastern region, it's probably less problematic than in vast swathes of Central Africa, for example, where a lot of the food, farro yam, a lot of the starchy roots are being replaced by white bread and croissant. And these are realities, these are existing realities. So this narrowing of the base is important for the money-making industry. It's much simpler to produce one big line of that. And that tells us, of course, that there are socioeconomic underpinnings of extinction. It's not just an event that's happening in the physical or the biological world. There are very, very strong socioeconomic underpinning. And to do that, we can look first at the economic models, at the policy frameworks, at the market pressures, which encourage practices detrimental to biodiversity, such as our diets. So the influence of neoliberal policies, of international trade agreement, financial investments on land use decisions, that is that underlies a lot of the biodiversity loss. Institutions like the IMF, the WTO, these prioritize economic growth without any regard for the environmental consequences. And here in Lebanon today, just for people who don't count us for areas, we're begging the IMF to take us over and adopt us as its class. I mean, this is not unimportant, at that stage, because it links to what we're doing. But there are huge, much bigger than Lebanon, huge events of mass extinction. For example, all the palm oil production in Indonesia. Large tropical forests of Indonesia, interspecies, orangutans, and which are disappearing. And of course, the entire biofuel production, which is, I just can't understand the logic behind it, except to create shortages in grain and try to play a little bit with global food supply. But that also has been a big problem. All of these issues are connected with one particular economic model, which is associated with different other socio-political models of human existence, which are the triad of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism. I'm sorry, that's maybe too many isms, but I'm just an old person. I've read the stuff a long time ago. I just couldn't move into the. I tried, but I just couldn't. It kept bringing me back to these extremely basic forces and powers. And of course, settler colonialism, which you mentioned in Gaza, also continues to ravage and cause it. So capitalism is an important part because it's characterized by the private ownership of production the means of production by, of course, the bourgeoisie, market competition, and the pursuit of profit. Under capitalism, natural resources are commodified, leading to exploitation rates that then exceed the natural regeneration capacities of ecosystems. We know that. That's been like super demonstrated. We don't really need to say more than that. Linking extinction with capitalism will have us look at how the economic and social system may influence rates of biodiversity loss. So, one, through resource exploitation, extraction for economic gain. Two, the creation of externalities, so capitalist markets fail to account for environmental costs. And if you're concerned about the price of food, please do know that historically the price of food is at its lowest in history. That has to do with reducing the cost of labor, of course, by feeding people at a lower cost and therefore having to pay them less. Also, an intrinsic part of that only can be made possible if we remove completely the externalities associated with the production of food, among them biodiversity, extinction of species, do not put a price on that, etc. The other is, of course, consumerism. I'm sure we're all aware of this. I'm not going to go more into that detail. Globalization promotes the market economy. Spread of invasive species is a part of this. Over my lifetime, and I'm lucky enough to have a longer lifetime, over my lifetime, I have seen fish disappear and be replaced with fish. Yes, I am that old. But also, the rate at which these extinctions are happening is also super fast. So this is not something that we just talk about as we look into a book. Another issue is, of course, the creation that's associated with capitalism is the creation of inequalities, deepening inequalities. Just look around you these days, and I think you can measure that, which means that those in wealth will exploit resources for their leisure or profit, and those who are not will actually have to keep digging into the same resource at the risk of, again, putting them under stress. Other issues connected with this is short-termism, but more importantly, and that's, I would really want you to think about, is the ability of the oligarchy, which is usually, another fancy word to talk about capitalists, to influence policy making and the legal framework. Don't underestimate that. That's a very important part. And I think if you've lived in Lebanon over the past 3-4 years, you have had plenty of opportunities to actually examine this close. So this is what drove Jason Moore, a very interesting author, which I suggest at least you follow on X if you don't want to read his books, to talk about the camp fallacy. That, you can't really spread all of that on everyone. There are people who sit at the basis of this. And one of his nicest books, because it talks about a person or two people that I respect, is called Capitalism as World Ecology, Brodel and Marx on Environmental History. That's written by Jason Moore. I suggest this as a good book. And he presents a framework for understanding the development of capitalism through a new lens. So he challenges the traditional separation of nature and society and argues again that the rise and development of capitalism cannot be fully understood without considering its ecological implications. That was one of the first times that we're saying you really have to look again at the ecology. The second model or mode, which usually accompanies capitalism, is what is termed colonialism. Now we may now say that, oh, come on, now you're bringing up colonialism again, and that's done, and people have liberated themselves and fallen into worse situations, and so I would throw back neo-colonialism at you and colonialism by proxy. We can have that discussion later. But anyway, historically, this whole extinction is not starting today. It started at a time where it started to accelerate at a time where colonial power imposed agricultural systems focused on monoculture for exports in order to feed workers, and in the factories, in the mills that were transforming primary products coming from the colonies as well, and then re-exporting them to the colonies. That's a very simplified model of all of that. But imposing all of this came with also the homogenization of ecosystems, and also the introduction of invasive species and the loss of native biodiversity. So the expansion of European agricultural practices into the Americas, but also into the Middle East, remains until today as a legacy of production and consumption. So that brings us back to the production and consumption. In the Middle East and North Africa, so let me bring us back home, colonial powers introduced large-scale agricultural projects, such as the French colonial wheat farms in Algeria and the British cotton plantation in Egypt. And the environment in Egypt and biodiversity in Egypt continues to this day to pay the price. And it's been, this whole concept was exported to northern Syria, which continues to pay the price with the water of the Euphrates and the salinization of land and the further disappearance of agro-biodiversity. So a person who's talked a lot about these issues is Frans Fanon, and again, I know that's like an old book. It's all right, there are some good things in old books. And in The Wretched of the Earth, he discusses this decolonization process and its impacts on rural population, including peasants. That brings me to the last part of my very long talk. Fanon argued that colonialism and the capitalist system that brought with it dispossessed peasants of their lands and traditional way of life, leading to social dislocation and economic dependency. In the context of Moore's analysis, this displacement can be linked to environmental degradation, as traditional agricultural practices, which often maintain biodiversity and ecological balances, were replaced by industrial agriculture with its tendency towards monoculture and its contribution to the loss of species. So capital, colonialism, dispossession of small peasants, different from the agrarian question in the north, the colonial agrarian question, big colonial, which, colonial capital entering the countryside of the countries of the south, damaged local farming systems, and introduced, for reasons that have to do with mercantilism, introduced a new mode of production, made people farmers, laborers on the land that they used to farm, so farm hands on the land, and in the process drove us to the loss of species. Now, connecting these ideas together, we can see that there is a tapestry of economic, social, and environmental transformations driven by the forces of capitalism and colonialism, leading to the loss of both traditional peasant societies and the natural ecosystem. Hence, we're looking here at two extinctions. One is, of course, a biological extinction. This is why we're here, to talk. But another one is a social extinction. An extinction of large parts of society. And a person who is also old, but who passed recently, so old material, who's talked about this, one of the earliest people to actually notice that in our region was Samir Amin. So Samir Amin was, you may know him, passed away like 5 years ago, a very interesting Marxist economist. In what I consider is one of his best work for me in my field, which is contemporary imperialism and the agrarian questions, he frames the severe consequences of integrating the southern peasantry into a global agro-food system dominated by monopolies. He of course talks about the extinction of species and the loss of biodiversity, but he also makes sure to tell us that this will unavoidably lead to the disenfranchisement and impoverishment of massive swathes of the peasant population, which is going to push them towards the extinction of traditional farming practices, resulting in what he calls the genocide of half of humanity. So that's a genocide that is way bigger than many of the genocides. Let me quote him here. The argument that is that capitalism has solved the agrarian question in its developed centers has always been admitted by large sections of the left, including within historical Marxism, as testified by the famous book of Kautsky on the agrarian question, written before First World War. Leninism itself inherited that view, and on this basis undertook a modernization of agriculture through the Stalinist collectivization with doubtful results. What was always overlooked was that capitalism, while it solved the question in its centers, did so by creating a gigantic agrarian question in the peripheries, which it cannot solve but through the genocide of half of humankind. Amin argues for a radical shift towards policies that recognize and protect the value of peasant agriculture, advocating for food sovereignty as a fundamental right. He suggests that a sustainable and just global food system must prioritize the needs and rights of those most vulnerable to the forces of capitalism. His call for a transition towards more humane and rational development logic is framed as an urgent necessity to avert another extinction, that of a crucial segment of humanity's food producers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rami, for. I think I can manage loud enough. Oh, thank you. So thank you, Rami. But what I'm going to talk about is living through the sixth. So kind of being an observer of extinctions that are ongoing, rather than just having evidence, geological, maybe other kinds of evidence for extinctions that have taken place in the past. I'm a plant biologist, so I study plants, and just in our backyard here in Beirut, extinctions have been going on and are ongoing. So I'm also old, and some of these extinctions have happened during my lifetime. So just to give you an idea of the current status of Lebanese plants, we have over 2,600 species of plants in Lebanon. This is quite a high density of plants given the small area of the country. And of these, 4.1% are approximately endemic to Lebanon, which means they just grow in Lebanon and nowhere else. So the extinction of these 4% would be a global extinction because they do not occur anywhere else. Rami mentioned that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, assesses species and assigns them to categories based on risk. We are unfortunately way behind in our assessment. In 2018, we had only assessed 227 species of those. And of these, 8.7% were threatened. And by extrapolating based on this data, only 1% of our flora is actually threatened, which is way an underestimate, given that only in 2-3 years we're up from around 25 to 100 species that are now threatened as we assess more and more of our native flora. So how do we deal with this? So one approach that we undertook here with the colleagues at AUB and elsewhere was to try and identify priorities, because there is no way we could actually protect everything, because development is happening, people need to produce food, corruption in the government, etc. So it's really difficult to actually protect everything. And unfortunately, many of the protected areas that are already existent have been designated not necessarily based on solid scientific studies, but sometimes based on political interventions and sometimes based on cultural reasons, like protecting all the cedar forests, for example. So we identified at the time 26 areas in Lebanon that are priorities for conservation. I'm not going to bore you with all of this. I'm just going to focus on this coastal strip, which is 220 kilometers from north to south. Along the coast, we've identified around 6 areas. The coast has more than 500 species, of which 3 are endemic to the Lebanese coast. The coast has been exceptionally threatened by urbanization, among other reasons. I mean, Rami mentioned a lot of reasons, including climate change, pollution, overexploitation of resources, etc. So if we just take Beirut and how quickly it has expanded from the 1840s to today, it has technically extirpated most of the Ras Beirut area. So at one time in 1873, if you look at the map, there was out here AUB, and then most of the city was in downtown. So we were technically living in the wilderness here. And only in 1923, the two areas were connected. So that was shortly after World War I. And you know how big the city is now. Almost nothing is left. Our colleague Salma Talko would argue that we have no area in Lebanon that is natural. In fact, almost every area in Lebanon is semi-natural, and especially along the coast. And I totally agree with her. So one of these species that is endemic to the coast and is very common along the roadsides in the city is Matiola, Mantur, and it's season for it now. So if you drive past Roshi, you can see the beautiful purple flowers on the side. Not the hollyhocks, the big tall ones, but rather short ones with nice purple flowers. And one of our students, Rami, was also involved in this work at one point. So he mapped the populations that are left behind, and we tried to make sense of what's going on. But technically it's a series of extinctions and recolonizations and extinctions and recolonizations. So plants don't read books. They just do what they do to survive. And this plant has just been taking over places that you wouldn't imagine, even cement, asphalt, paved roads. It would grow anywhere, extremely resilient. The sand strip is probably more important. And the construction of the airport and then the urban sprawl that we have south of Beirut has technically rendered nothing left of the sand strip, maybe just a few patches of sand. And I was at a museum in France, and I saw a collection from the 1950s from Radio Orient, which is basically where Nef'a is today. It's where they register cars in the southern suburb. And he's collected a plant that he notes is everywhere, even on side roads. Very pretty yellow flowered plant. And only 50 years later, in early 2000s, I looked everywhere in the city, in every remnant of sand, even in the southern suburb, in gardens of houses, nothing left. It's just gone. And with time, I realized that it's not the only plant that has disappeared. Although many of the other plants, it's a matter of local extinction, so they still occur in other countries, but even that, it's serious. Now, surprisingly, we decided at one point to venture into the airport and check the situation there, because we thought that the airport is kind of a protected area. So what if these plants found refuge there? And we did actually manage to find one species that is doing very well in the airport. However, when we attempted to negotiate with them about weed control, it was not an easy thing. And after that, we never got permission to enter the airport and survey anything. So with another colleague of mine from landscape, same department as Rami, Naila Al-Aqal, she's now the Dean of Students, we decided that we should probably look among the dead. So why not cemeteries? Because this is technically one of few places that are still green in the city. And so we mapped some of these cemeteries and surveyed them. And while we didn't find any of the species that went extinct or any species of conservation interest for that purpose, this doesn't rule out the possibility that plants may have the chance of surviving there. So maybe we should consider cemeteries as kind of ancillary gardens, as again my colleague Salma Tarhouk would argue. So what can we do? And this is mainly what I would like to engage the audience in the discussion. So what can we do as we wait for the city to come to us? Because the city is just expanding. In ultimately everything would be gone. So should we care? And if we should care, why should we care? I had a very interesting discussion with Nadia at her office where we were considering what I could address, given that Rami was going to be on the panel. I'd say I'm kind of Rami's student in a way. We all are, and I look up to him too. You're welcome.
You're the man we look up to.
Thank you. So I wanted to look into the idea of why these plant species are going to extinction during our lifetime. What is our role and what can we do? I'm not going to bore you with values. Rami mentioned ecosystem services, and I could list all kinds of different values that are coming up every now and then. Intrinsic value, aesthetic value, religious value, social justice value, etc. So should we actually care, and do we matter? Like, would it really matter if we care and we do something? I was once told, and I really like this, that the main cause of our environmental problems, specifically when it comes to biodiversity, are two things: me now and not in my backyard. And I think that's really something to consider. So one of my favorite children's books writers is Dr. Seuss. And in his famous book, The Lorax, he talks about the extinction of a species of trees due to overexploitation. And he touches on the commons and capitalism and a lot of the issues that Rami mentioned directly or indirectly. And in the book, towards the end, he actually points out that unless someone cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. So I'm very glad that I've been invited here, and I think it is worth, particularly in a very multidisciplinary environment, to look at why we should care a whole awful lot, and would it actually make a difference. Thank you.
It's fine. I think my voice is loud. Okay, yeah, okay.
Camera.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, okay. So when Nadia told me about this panel on extinctions, I thought directly, how do I relate? Okay, I'm a geologist, and geologically, I'm not that old. So that's our good side. So I thought, what is it? I mean, how does extinction relate to me? Obviously, if we're talking about geological times, we are not, as human beings, we cannot witness extinctions because, I mean, unless you tell me that we are witnessing it right now and we have the bad luck to be living it right now. But even when they decided for the Anthropocene, 15 groups of geologists said, no, Anthropocene is not an epoch, it's an event. And it is yet unfolding, and it is when it ends that we are able to address it as an epoch and not now. So basically, human beings for us are somehow negligible on the time scale. So we occurred at, if we take the entire year as the entire story of the Earth, we occurred 24 December, somewhere around that. And then we did fireworks and did the CO2 emissions. And so basically, I thought that I relate to extinction somehow with something called a latent cause for extinction, something that nobody, they speak a lot about it when it comes to affect their food security, when it comes to affect energy, when it comes to affect our life, but nobody speaks about it as the pristine water, or I deal more with groundwater. So this water that, okay, without making any publicity here, this is the water that we all drink, and in the MENA region and in our Arab region, this is the only source of fresh water that we have. And since forever, it has been under a lot of stresses. So we can count some anthropic stresses that are the increase of demand, even with all the technological advancements that are more prominent in the northern part than in the southern part, such as wastewater reuse and all of our attempts to decrease the demand of water, we are still using a lot, and we are still using it in priorities that are very much related to our socioeconomic needs. So also we have a most recent forcing that is, picking up right now. It has been picking up a lot earlier, and that is climate change. So climate change, not only with the increase of temperature that affects a lot the water cycle, and the increase and somehow the random patterns of precipitations that have a lot of effect on us. If you just look at if a precipitation occurs with a high intensity during a small period of time, this has a huge effect on the water well that you have in the backyard. So water levels are dropping, and we can see this. If we just look at the 1975 topographic maps of Lebanon and we plot all the springs that were plotted back then, we can see that many of them are not occurring right now, and that they're no longer emerging because the water table has dropped. And there's, so for instance, in the Litani Basin, we have a drop of 40 meters over a period of 70 years, and that's huge. And all of this because of agricultural needs during times where water is at its, the utmost shortage. So Lebanon has rain during six months during the year, now 4. It depends how we see it. We have a lot of seasonality, wet, dry, average years. And during most of the period, like 1/3 of the time, we have no rain, or even 6 months during the year. So all of this increases a shortage period of about getting to 100 days where we do not have a supply that is able to feed the demand. And we can observe it at very local scale. So how my work relates, I observe springs. So I have a small experimental site that goes beyond a lab. So it's what we call a catchment area. It's a place where we collect data from different springs, climate, rivers, etc. And I've been doing that for 10 years. So just like you go, I don't go to cemetery. It's just part of my catchment. But I've been collecting it. In 1970, we had a very nice hydrogeologist. His name was Mangin. And if you look at his notebooks, he used to go to springs and try to observe them. So this is what I want to do eventually. I have only 60 years to live, so I hope to be able to see all of them. So basically, by observing these, I try to model the flow in a certain catchment area. So I put all of this in a numerical model, and I try to calibrate and validate to reproduce the observation that I have. And this requires a lot of time because I need to validate it. I cannot tell you that my model is unique unless I validate it. And even though if I look back at it and try to simulate the year after, maybe my model will not work perfectly well. And this is fine because we're doing science and we have a lot of uncertainties. So what I did is I just plugged into the model of 3 springs that for which I did some numerical simulations. I plugged some sort of global climatic downscaled model for Lebanon. Now, in Lebanon, the problem with the climate is that we have a lot of uncertainty. It's such a small country with a lot of geomorphology. So if we rely on on large-scale global models, it's very difficult to know how will the temperature behave or how will the precipitation behave. And on top of that, we have the problem of the snow. So we did some downscaling based on historic data and based on the data that we have for this particular catchment. And then what we discovered is that until 2100, we discovered that we will have a lot of variability during the year. So years where we would have a spring would give, instead of the needed values of 500 liters per second, it will give 100 liters per second or 70 liters per second. And that is not only dependent on the geometry of the spring itself, because the geometry of the spring doesn't change over 1,000 years. Okay, so here the scales come again. So what is the scale at which I'm observing a variation? So we figured out that, for instance, in I'm just gonna give you 1 year, 2034 would be a very dry year. We would have shortage times of 204 days. I mean, now we have about 120 days. So that's a lot. And we will have the demand with the increasing urbanization, that will increase substantially because we're not doing anything to decrease the demand because we're not even conscious that this water might disappear. If we have shortage during the summertime, we just call a tank, it comes. Nobody feels really how precious is water, and second, we don't pay for it the right amount. So this is why I talk about it as a latent disease. So, also the snow cover will decrease very rapidly, and we'll soon have high melting that would occur much faster, and this is why we will have shortages, because the melt recharges the groundwater, and later on, if it recharges the groundwater very rapidly, it will come out at the spring very rapidly. And a well is not always a solution. So, given all of this, here we have looked at what would become the status of groundwater in the future. And we have pinpointed a very important problem. But the question is, what should we do? I mean, I don't have a straight answer because my usage of groundwater depends on the usage of people for other sectors that are highly dependent on the socioeconomic wealth of a certain country. So, for instance, if I want to export avocado, so lately I was looking at Facebook and I looked at someone saying, finally avocado from Lebanon in Germany somewhere. Yeah. And class 1, like first class. I thought about it, and even in Spain, they cultivate avocado and they have one of the worst, this year they had one of the worst droughts ever. So I asked myself, and I had this discussion with Rami before, so how do you weigh all of this? I mean, is water more important or is food security more important? Do I have to import? Is it better to import avocado instead of exporting it? Do I have to look at my entire economical system to account for this precious resource? Second, energy. So, for instance, many people are putting some solar panels on their wells to pump as much as they can, especially during the last energy problem. So, and the shortage of electricity. I mean, this is not doable if I don't know the safe yield of my well. I cannot just pump without doing the proper studies. So this is how you can see that groundwater is very much related to a nexus, to energy, to food, to health, and I consider it as a pillar. I don't consider it just as a point in the nexus. It's a pillar without which, if I just remove it, I mean, everything will collapse. We'll become 2D instead of a 3D framework. So, but again, I'm someone who's very fanatic for water and groundwater per se. So, so basically, the impacts that we have are observed at local scale. And if we look at the larger scale, we can see them happening in the MENA region, because I work a lot in the MENA. And recently, I was also involved in a project in Africa, in Uganda, and we can see those discrepancies happening. So, for instance, in Uganda, they pay for people to drill a well, given that they have an irrigation system. And this is a problem because, I mean, we're working on the demand and the availability and all of that. It's fine, it's fine. That's my call to end. So there are a lot of discrepancies between north and south. Sometimes we hear the north saying, yeah, you should use less than 250 liters per day for the south, and you can find people in Uganda going X kilometers to pick up 20 liters per day, while other people irrigate gardens in the north with 250 liters per capita per day. So there's a lot of discrepancies, and again, how do Rami touch upon this? How do those general policy or generic policy help us reduce these discrepancies? Do we have a generic policy that can address every single problem that we have, especially in water? So the other point that I'm going to end with just a question. So is this latent cause for extinction reversible? That's a question I have. I don't know, like, how could we, I mean, is it too late, or is it still time to try to figure out how to address this at the local scale and at the larger scale? Because local scale is very important too. So, that's it. So I just want to end. I have a lot of questions, and I'm somehow nested in my science, but lately I think it has to connect to many other social sciences and humanities to be able to find some answers to all of these questions that we're asking ourselves that really are highly linked to extinctions and its timescale. Thanks.
Okay, I guess I'll make a quick remark or two and then we'll open it up. So one connection that I see between all of the talks is the themes of scarcity on one hand and homogeneity on the other. Scarcity, whether that is an artificial food scarcity imposed on part of the world's population, though not all, scarcity of plants, biodiversity, or water scarcity. These all seem related, but not identical with processes that homogenize and create monoculture. So if any or all of you wanted to expand further on that relationship, where that relationship exists or doesn't exist, I think that would be interesting. Another connection I see is, the kind of necessity of moving between, mediating between local and larger systems and frameworks. So thinking about, for example, where the loss of one form of life in a kind of nation state actually ramifies into the kind of global, total loss, total extinction of that species. So if you wanted to dilate on that as a kind of, that expansion, that form of mediation, how in each of your work you kind of move between those systems, that would also be interesting. I have a question about, there's this moment in Mohammed's talk when you talked about how Lebanon is behind on assessing the, the IUCN? And that kind of prompted a question for me, which is also for all of you, about these processes of acceleration of loss and so on, whether and how they actually impact kind of your scientific methodologies, what you select as kind of objects of study or scientific procedures. Clearly, like, some of these things are happening at, one of the other things that you're mediating between is these timescales. Things are happening on like larger geological timescales, and I really appreciated the way that you brought that to bear on all of your talks. At the same time, I think you've all had experiences in kind of recent years of kind of actual historical processes accelerating in maybe ways that create a kind of different framework of selection or different methodology or something like that. I guess I'll leave it there and open it up for either, do you want to respond to any of that, or we can open it up to the audience?
Maybe they can say a few things and then we just open it up to some questions.
I can talk quickly about scarcity and homogeneity because I work on food, and as you know, I'm not going to repeat what I said about the inherent relationship, the dialectic between food and extinction, the production of food and extinction. But as you said, or you implied in your question, this scarcity is geographically and class built, class constructed. It's not a scarcity that exists. There is more food in the world today than there has ever been in the history of humanity, and the rate of growth in food production today exceeds globally exceeds the rate in population growth. So even if we're taking a Malthusian approach, which we of course don't want to take, but even if we are, we're still, there is no issue here. So scarcity today accompanies a glut in the production. You see that there are excess from the subsidized food, etc., that are produced. The problem is, as you rightly put it, is that this lack, this absence of scarcity is always sold to us as the reason for the homogenization of everything. I can only allow you, to eat 5,000 calories a day and then spend money on gyms and exercise clothing in order to burn the extra 3,000 and on health, in hospitals and stuff, only if you abide by the fact that, well, I need to streamline. So that's why there are like 4 companies in the world that trade 70% of the food that is currently consumed. And that's why those companies have been making tremendous profit. Cargill alone made over, like 30% more during the COVID crisis than it usually makes when everyone else was losing ground on this. So homogeneity is intrinsic and inherent to the way capitalism wants the world to be, because there is, of course, more efficiency in the production, the ability to feed people, workers, quote unquote, in a more homogeneous, processed diet that is inexpensive and that reflects well. So these homogeneity and scarcity, they go together. Now there is, of course, a center to periphery, a class-based scarcity, people who are food insecure. But we have extended this concept, by the way, when we talk about food insecurity, except when you're talking about what the Israelis are imposing on Gaza today. But if you're looking at it in most places, albeit not in all, right? Not in Somalia, not in countries in conflict, not in Yemen, not etc. But in most places, you'll find that some of the most food insecure people are actually overweight and suffer from diabetes type 2 and from and what is the reason? It's because food insecurity is not only about the quantity of calories, it's also where do these come from, and it's about your relationship. So again, the homogenization, homogeneity again here makes its impact. One of the biggest problems in the world, in introducing healthy, diversified diets is not big food. It's actually big pharma. You draw your own conclusion. These are the people who are most adamant on not moving towards healthier, different type of consumption. Because big food can adapt. Danone can actually convert into more healthy, etc. But big pharma cannot.
I just, do I have to wear something for the camera or?
No, I think you're.
I'm okay.
It's here, yeah.
Okay, great. No need, it's fine. It's fine, no need. So I would like to comment on the question that you raised of why we study what we study. I think you brought up this issue of why Lebanon is behind on assessing the species and why we end up studying what we're studying. It's a bit complex because there are 3 factors usually that determine what you study. Like you need to publish, there's the funding, and then there's the priorities. So the government usually has a national biodiversity strategy in which it would set priorities for research. And that usually affects the funding agencies, but not necessarily, because most of our funding is not from the government. And so usually the funding agency would impose their priorities. So I had a meeting with one of the funding agencies yesterday because I'm reviewing their strategy, and I asked him, why did you fund aquatic ecosystems of all ecosystems in the Mediterranean? And he said, because we got money from a donor who wanted to study aquatic ecosystems. So sometimes we have to adapt to the available funding. And then, of course, there's the issue of how charismatic the plants you study are. So if you are studying something more charismatic like iris, you're more probably to get funding than studying some less charismatic plant like a grass. Yeah, or a dandelion. So it's really quite complicated, but the main reason I believe why Lebanon is behind on assessing the species is that we don't have enough feet on the ground. I mean, we don't have enough people in this field. This is our main challenge. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get my question.
Oh, we should just
the-
make
yeah,
comments
but-
for the whole, yeah.
Yeah, so I would just leave it for a question and answer. That would be, yeah.
Yes.
I have a question, please. How do you assess if the species is threatened or endangered? Like what
It's
is the
a
baseline that you use to compare?
right. There's a set of standards that we usually follow. It's an international standard set by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and most of the time, when you don't have data over years, like in Lebanon, we go by the area of occupancy. So how big is the area occupied by the species, and what kind of threats is it affected by, and how many populations you have within that area. So a population being affected independently by a certain stress. So it's a complicated process. There are many categories, and most of the time, unless you have studied the species for 10 years or more, you don't have trends, so you will have to go with habitat. So how big is the habitat? How many populations do you have within it, and what kind of threats are affecting it? And then you assign a criterion. Now, there's something going on which is interesting. IUCN is moving away from this towards something called the ecosystem red list. So they're more keen at assessing ecosystems rather than species, because now the trend is to protect the ecosystem, which includes the species. So if you protect endangered ecosystems, you protect species, and one of the reasons is, as Rami mentioned, we don't know the species enough. So we say it's 5% or 1%, but 5% of what? So when you protect an ecosystem, you're more likely to protect even species that are unknown to science yet. So this is the new trend, the red list of ecosystems and habitats. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that was really great. I think it was really, there was so much in what you all said, and I think a question maybe that might, or a concept or a word that might somehow relate to, you know, the different, you know, what is to be done, or how to think, what do we need to think about water, plants, foods, you know, questions around food and agriculture. I mean, do you ever consider this? I mean, obviously the concept of the commons is a very interesting one. You brought it up from the Lorax.
Yeah,
but it's also an old concept, and I guess, I don't know what it would be, it's Arabic as al-masha', or I don't even know if that would make, if that makes has a similar connotation, but is there a way to, yeah, I mean, how would you think about something like the commons in relation, or in the question, what would it be like to construct something called the commons and then try to preserve that or something? Like this would be kind of, this would be something that came to mind. And another thing, I think more related to a point you were making, Rami, but also I think is another concept that could be relevant here, which, you know, it is a concept that comes up in Marx, but it's a very interesting, not many people take it up. It's this thing called the metabolic rift, right? This this idea that these crises that are generated on a global scale introduce these shifts in, you know, both they construct the relationship between human and nature and introduce a kind of a rift that becomes irreparable at the same time as the development of the same form of whatever social existence that we have everywhere. And it's really interesting that you said something about the Amazon turning from a lung to a colon, and also the thing about food and what you eat and what you had for breakfast. It's so metabolic. Even the it's at the core of, it seems to be at the core of this, and the plants, the water. I mean, how can water? You need water's life in a way. I mean, all these kinds of. Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think about concepts concepts that might put together these different, like the commons or metabolic rifts, or I mean, are there ways to construct something around these? Have you considered these? Would it be possible to imagine something that is disciplinary or framed around such a thing? I mean, this is framed around such concepts. Yeah,
Can I jump on that question just and add something quickly?
Yeah,
Just this with this question of the commons. I mean, I was also just kind of thinking about, you talked about peasant dispossession, and so one thing on my mind was, primitive accumulation, surplus population. Do we understand the kind of climate refugees of the future as a kind of surplus population? What does this all have to do with consumption, labor, management, warehousing?
Sure. I'm assuming these are directed towards me, so
no, I think
I can start. Joanna, do you want to have a go before me at any of these?
No, I think you're more holistic.
So, the thing is that the commons are not a material entity.
Mm-hmm.
It is a way of governance. So, this is an important thing. And the problem, one of the issues, not a problem, the issue is that this is I have to choose my words very carefully. But let me put it this way. This is a westernized lens of the commons, because it belongs to a way of governing society that has been transported to us, like state simplification, like cadastring, like ownership, like enclosures, all of these, they've come, and we're in the process of adapting, because they came as part of modernity, the creation of states, of nation states, of etc. Tarek is here, of course, and he's the big expert on all of this. But the situation in our region, and I'm only aware, mostly aware of this region here, is that you have, first of all, the land ownership, not tenure, ownership, and the physical ownership with the deed, etc. Again, it's been always a little bit around, but mostly after the 1860s, after the Ottoman Tanzimat, and when the Ottoman state started to want to modernize, etc. Although there were allocation, there is tenure, but not necessarily tenure as an ownership. But if you move a little bit further from the farm, that in Arabic in this region, we don't teach agriculture. This whole faculty, my faculty, is also something that came to us. There is, I use the Arabic terms, and then there is filaha and rai. And these are different schools, different entities, different places, different people, with of course some gray zones and some merging, because I saw, looking at me, austerely. So, there are people, they're not all in one block, but that's like the general place. So, and then we made, so filaha means plowing the land. So these are the farmers, okay? And then rai means the pastoralists. And of course, some pastoralists can become, they can practice agro-pastoralism on the margins and the fringe. But their relationship to the commons is very different. So also these are relationships when we brought them, these relationships are based on a certain type of governance that has completely disappeared. Customary laws, tribal relations that we have tried to replace, and post-colonial leadership has actually continued to want to replace them. So they got rid of the colonizer, of the colonizer, but not of the colonizer's thought, which remained ingrained, mostly because a lot of the leaders were themselves trained in colonized, in colonies or in, educational colonies. So it's a long answer to say that when we talk about the commons, we need to make sure that, what are we talking about? So, just throwing in the term like Harding, the commons, is a very different entity, because what he means by it, and, he was like an execrable gentleman, with a lot of very, like the tragedy of the common, which is very racist and classist document, which I teach to my students as such. And so we need to talk about the way we are. He's talking more about open space entrenched in individualism, in methodological individualism. Take methodological individualism as an overarching philosophy, and then you got this space, and the only way you can manage those space is starting from this methodological individualism. So of course, once you start like this, once you set all your premises, you fix them, of course you're going to end up having extinction and degradation. But that is not what all histories and all cultural histories tell us. So that's like a long answer about the commons, but I think that it's in a nutshell, it's going to be very difficult to create systems of communal commons within a broader individualistic system that encloses it. You're going to have a clash within systems. Like a basic law of systems is that no subsystem can grow independently from the larger system that encloses it. Either we're going to look at a systemic change, which means we have to start thinking about everything and then become militant and, possibly take arms. I'm looking at the camera for that, stand strong with that. Or we're just going to continue thinking about ways to change the world, but not, taking the means, to paraphrase Marx somewhere. So this is where we are in this. And I think a lot of it applies to the other question, to the core issues of primitive accumulation. So who does it, who's doing it, where, and what capital. We tend to always see primitive accumulation only in terms of material capital, but primitive accumulation of intellectual capital is also a very interesting area that needs to be thought, which as academics who are interested in their promotion and their sustainability in life, we practice in a very cavalier way, and so on and so forth. Now, the metabolic rifts idea of Marx is absolutely fabulous, and it started in soil. I trained as a soil scientist. That's my initial thing. Nobody wanted to do soil science, and then everybody now wants to do soil science. But it started because he noticed that if you keep removing, if you keep planting, you can keep removing things, eating them in the city, and throwing the sewage into the sea, then there's going to be a complete breakdown of the system that's based on nutrients. And this is what he called the initial steps of the metabolic rift, where food from somewhere suddenly becomes food from nowhere for most of the populations. You go here, where do you get your food from? From the supermarket. Where does it come from? From the supermarket. So there is no cycle, there is no returning, etc. And the metabolic rift is actually really interesting in that respect. And that, of course, means that we're totally unconcerned about the avocado that we eat. So to go to the example, which is, by the way, the plague of Lebanon, because avocado farms are not only, they don't only export water, use a lot of groundwater, and export water very, very cheaply in terms of virtual water. but in a metaphoric way, that same water is used to launder, because water is used to launder a lot of money that comes from primitive accumulation in other countries of the South. You know, like and agriculture and farming, these large is a really good way to launder money. I can teach you how off camera.
Wow, where are these avocado plantations?
South.
South.
That's precisely my point.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's you know,
point
you have
very
to see
clear.
who are the investors. How is capital circulation, and you know, where is it coming from? How is it circulating? How is it being re-exported? Cash. It's a fascinating thing. I know because I'm an avocado farmer. No.
Okay.
Very small, because it takes too much water, and I don't dig into the groundwater, but other people do.
Off camera.
I don't. I don't. But I don't precisely for this reason. No, I have a few trees. That's all.
Do you either of you wanna add anything?
No, I think I liked how you pointed out that the concept of the commons has evolved. I think what we now call the commons does not necessarily match what initially it was meant to be. I mean, now we use commons for almost everything that is shared. Sometimes it's not exactly the same definition. But I wonder when, maybe Ramin was, maybe Tariq. So how long ago did this idea of masha' start?
It's Ottoman for sure, no?
No, it's okay. So again, people used to live in communities. This is, you know, it's important because we tend to forget this a little bit. But those of us who are still a little bit connected to villages, etc., understand that while there are a lot of tensions within communities, the understanding of mutual dependence was very important. So, you know, this is a country where a lot of the agriculture takes place on carefully and laboriously crafted stone-walled bench terraces. And it's impossible to maintain the terraces. It's super expensive on your own. You have to have other people from your own community work with you on them. It's impossible. It is imposed by the nature of these structures. The land imposes this on you. But when you start importing 90% of your food, or when you turn your terraces into cash crops such as mulberry for silkworm production, then you enter a completely different economic trade. You become integrated into global markets. By the way, Lebanon has been integrated in the global markets, well, I'd say, at least since the beginning of the 19th century. Hence the famine. I think there was a talk about the Great Syrian famine not long ago, or I don't know if it has happened yet or not. The history department was bringing someone, but I think, you know, it's extremely interesting to look at that. So before that, there were a lot of spaces, more land than could be used, and the process was ihya al-ard, making it alive. So land was called, so it could be masha, so, you know, and you can come and say, I want to use so much, and then you can use. Or land can be called mawat, so it's a dead land. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have any life in it. It means it's not producing. It's not part of the production cycle. And you can make it live, ihya al-ard, from hayat, from life. And so there is a lot, but who allocates? There is a person, you know, who sits with an advisory group, and this kind of relationship, you know, tribal structure relationship has eroded, of course, a lot. Not all of it was good. A lot of it was bad. Not, you know, but it was never truly well replaced. I mean, these customary laws jumped immediately into the capitalistic world without passing through a process. And that is credited to colonialism and the mandate and, the la mission civilisatrice and, and all of that comes.
And may I ask another question? So in my village, some aspects of this are still there. For example, sharing the water. So we have Yanabia and Ayun, and then they divide the water. So you get 1 day, you get 2 days, you get 3 days, whatever. And the way they deal with it, to me, is similar to what would be commons in a way. So, so do you think the concept of the commons could be applied in such scenarios? I mean, it wouldn't be applicable everywhere and in general, but do you think it would be applicable in such scenarios, and do you think it would be relevant?
Yes, but you require two things. Some kind of a legal framework, because the land that receives the water, is divided into karats.
Right.
Karats, which is the hours of irrigation.
Right.
It's on the deed, on the title deed.
Senate.
So there is an overarching legal structure that defines it. You can sell it, you can buy it, you can lend it to somebody. So this is, of course, required. And what is required is community homogeneity. So your village has probably still some sort of this. But if you look at these same relationships in certain areas of the Bekaa, where you have different tribes, upstream and downstream, all of these systems stop working, whereas they used to work. Because of a tribal equilibrium, I'm using tribe very, because of an equilibrium that existed, a power equilibrium, which was removed by changes in the nature of the politics, but not completely. It was just removed enough to continue to harm, but not to be able to build anything on it. So I'm going back to that. So it went from the need to interact and find a balance to banditry, because there are no repercussions to what you do. So the entire system of dealing with conflict has been completely removed, broken, but not replaced with statal laws that are strong enough to be able to impose themselves. Which is not a totally bad thing, because, as we've said before, it would serve the oligarchy.
Thank you.
So, what's missing from all this is states, which you brought in indirectly. And I agree, your approach to capitalism should be the starting point. But we need to remember that a lot of the destruction of the commons and state simplification happened in the days of Sumeria and Sargon of Akkad, etc., etc. And then we actually invented the system before blaming the West. So states of grain, etc., rather than, or you have a wheat-based state rather than a lentil-based state or something. This was actually a process of state simplification which went on before Christ in this part of the world. And I think that's really important for when we talk about our problems, that states have played a key role in it. And notice it's a fragmented state system here, which is alien to the region because it's imposed by Europeans, and it replaces what was the usual order, which was of large empires, which is where the Mashah actually comes from the state, because it was a way of making a village, paying the village taxes collectively. And states used to be based on villages doing that. So this also then opens actually all the stuff, what scientists should be thinking about, I think, is they tend to think along a methodological nationalism. What is the policy in Lebanon? What do we do in Lebanon? Who are the funders? But actually all of these problems are being magnified by the state system. You would not have had such a big Beirut if the Ottoman Empire had endured, right? Or even if there had been a greater Syria, or if there hadn't been French colonization of Syria, where they make it the capital of the mandate. And then you have, of course, settler colonialism and refugees and things like this. So I think the states have to be brought into the story and linked to this whole process of capitalism and
Yes.
of metabolic rift. And the disappearance of the state in the biqa', as Rami said, might actually be a boon, because it returns to the local. Because the other thing which is interesting in the state simplification is that it's a bit like a metabolic rift on a political legal scale, that it actually brings a general homogenizing view onto what is a very localized ecology, and overcomes practices which are adapted to that ecology over the centuries with this sort of general view, which may not work. And you can see terrible results of this. Less so actually in the French mandated ones than in the British, particularly in Jordan, where they were most successful at state simplification and have had the worst ecological results.
That's right. So Talia, I agree. When we've discussed this many times, but even during Sargon II, pastoralists had their very own space, which was managed differently without enclosures. I think that it is the encroachment on what are agro ecosystems that were managed for extensive pastoralism. And you see this a lot in Jordan as well, and you know that, you see that. The encroachment and the creation of enclosures on these dissect completely the landscape and remove its continuity and cause phenomena of extinction.
That's where the non-state comes in, because the tribal structures actually stretch across the ecological niches. Even if you look at this myth of nomad versus settled as being in a hierarchy, the relationship between them is one of khuwa. That's brotherhood. Right? So it's a much more balanced kind of relationship than as envisaged in nomads predating.
Oh, absolutely.
On that. And so therefore actually the nomads bring this, they are brought into the system of management, of ecological management, and from there also the force which provides the state with the coercion. Yeah. So now people don't talk about nomad versus settled, the Mongol. There's actually shadow empires based in the steppe which interact with the key empires around these areas of alluvial agriculture, and have driven the process of not just accumulation of wealth, but also a political accumulation, where you grab more land, you then use that to tax, and then the resources and the institutions all get imposed on it, whether it's mashah, etc., etc. And this is all imposed on groups of people who are trying to live in very local ecologies. So that's the process you want to bring in. And I think that rather than talk about nomad versus settled, you talk about a spectrum with people using multi-resource economies, because it works better. It's much more adapted to the ecologies. And one of the trouble with, I think, the capitalist system and the post-colonial system is they want people to specialize. Yeah. And actually, it's worse. It started under the Ottomans, who arrived with a view that, okay, the nomad is not very good for state building. What we need to do is to create this farmer in a village we can tax. And that was the beginning of the... But they were forced to accommodate to the nomads. And so you ended up with a very mixed system until really the post-colonial era, when you get states strong enough and with enough mobility and resources, what one sociologist called infrastructural power, to actually sweep in and sweep these people aside.
Yeah, I mean, we'll continue this discussion later, but it's not. It's the state power in this particular region, even in places such as Morocco, for example, and which in principle should have a strong state power, is not sufficient to curb the power of capital when it uses traditional modes of production, of land production, as a means for accumulation. I'll give you an example, because that was a long, complicated sentence. I can just steal it. So the state there has been a lot of conflict very recently in Morocco that the state is unable to quell between pastoralists that are very often called Arab for a number of reasons, and between settled farmers. At a time, after the time when the whole production systems of both places are changing. So, for example, the pastoralists have changed completely the production system. They're not even the same people who do that. In response to a big demand in meat in the city, pastoralism happens in trucks. You can see this in the Syrian desert a lot. People move. There's whole notion of the Bedouin and their flocks moving in the Badia from one place to another. That's like almost completely disappeared. There are big trucks and water from place to place. And that is how capital penetrated these places. So the state here has been completely powerless.
But why are you putting the state against capital?
No,
the state works for capital.
Yes, of course, I am not. That's what I was trying to say to you, that the state itself, the presence of the state is not sufficient. Because I understood that your argument was...
No, you misunderstood. I'm saying that simply the state is an element in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the way the state articulates with this broad capitalist drive is more complicated than North-South or the Samir Amin sort of, homilies. And that's what we need to begin with.
So here's my take on this. Now I understand. So I should not have used Western, but I wanted to just simplify the thing. I should have possibly
No, you're an old Marxist, and you're still going back to your youth.
Yeah,
and,
old and young. But no, what I want...
I know you too well.
What I want to use is like notions of center and periphery, just old Marxist notions. Centers and periphery and comprador. So when I say the West, I don't mean a location. I mean a mode of capital accumulation that has its own people in here, people who belong to the West while they're living in Lebanon. And, this should surprise no one, because we're actually sitting in one of those locations. So, this is exactly, but for simplifying the context, I didn't want to go back to Babylon and Sargon, and I just wanted to frame
but I think that's important.
Things that are easy.
But that's important because that's a different aspect of state power. Yeah? So we're looking at capitalism with accumulation and metabolic rifts. That's one set of things you need to think about. Now, I don't think scarcity is a very intelligent thing, by the way, because scarcity comes out of neoclassical economics and how you allocate a given set of resources. We're talking about a long process of historical change. But there's also another set of factors going on here, which is the creation of a state system which serves capital and is part of capital. But it so happened that the state system actually started before capitalism actually emerged, and then spread, and actually spread also before it, right? And replaced other different sorts of state systems in our part of the world. Now, and this is something which has not been theorized enough by Marxism, and it's certainly ignored by Samir Amin. And that's why I think it's a really bad way in to go back to that sort of argument. Yeah. We have much better historical sociologists and Marxian analyses than Amin provides. Yeah.
Well, Andreas?
Yeah, it sounds to me like, this is a very fascinating debate, but it sounds to me like you're drawing a lot on James Scott. Yes. Is that correct?
No, I'm actually starting from what you do, which is Robert Brenner, but mixing it with Scott.
Yeah, okay, because in Scott's view, these states that are based on grain, and he's focusing on Mesopotamia, before Mesopotamia to an extent at least, or rather more fascinating at least in my view, is Egypt. But anyway, for him, these are states, primarily, that follow what you refer to as a state logic. But the argument from someone like Samir Amin, I think, would be to say that this was the tributary mode of production. So the state shouldn't be fetishized as a state, because the state
Serve the ruling class.
yes, the state was the ruling class. It was a class. It was a form of mode of production that preceded the capitalist mode of production, where the state was a class agent. And this is the thing that James Scott just refuses to accept, because he's so wedded to anarchism, where the problem is the state as such. That said, I think you're right about the environmental destructiveness of these early formations, but I think a Marxist analysis of these formations is more illuminating, because it can show that this environmental destruction is a form of class power, pre-capitalist class power. And I would stress the importance of using, in particular, Amin's concept of the tributary mode of production.
I agree with all that, but the point about the tributary mode is it reflects different sort of tributary formations with different levels of state centralization. And that's what's left out of Amin's whole story. And part of it is that he's actually Egyptian. So he deals much more with a settled peasantry rather than a mixed population of peasants and pastoralists. Because it's the pastoralists who actually play a big role in the state formation and in expanding or reducing the coercive powers of a lot of these states. So Sargon of Akkad, the Akkadians start off as nomads. You know. And what has emerged in our part of the world, which I think should be brought into the story of the state, is, you know, this old story going back to the 14th century historical sociologist Ibn Khaldun, who also had an idea not only about how elites circulate and form the states and are connected to tribes, but also an idea of how does the state then stabilize its rule through what he called the circle of justice, which is a very important trope going through all the states right back to Babylon and today, and forms a moral economy which stabilizes things and works with the ecology in a very important way. And I think this is something which analyses which start from Marx, which starts in Europe, don't actually capture.
Well, this is really interesting. Maybe we can take it. There's food on the terrace for lunch. Please,
We can take it to the dinner.
yeah. But there's lunch served on the terrace if anyone is not fasting and wishes to come and join us.
Thank you very much.